Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Old Kirk, and welcome to the start of 2 days discussions about the influence of Adam Smith. I particularly welcome the audience coming out at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, when you might have other demands in your time, but no greater demand than this, I suspect. I want to welcome someone in particular. I want to give a special welcome to my wife, Barbara, whose birthday gift for today is a ticket for this event. I could also say I'm delighted to say that in a short time, I'll be introducing the speakers for today from the University of Glasgow, who have been so incredibly helpful in the organising of the events over the last 2 days. My sister and my late brother were both graduates of the University of Glasgow. I was a family outcast and attended Edinburgh. The design of the 2 days is quite simple. This morning, we're going to be considering aspects of education. This afternoon, we have a large panel of distinguished philosophers, one of whom is in the audience from the United States. So I hope if you haven't signed up for this afternoon, you'll think about coming back. I think this is probably going to be the largest panel of philosophers ever put together in Kirkcaldy. And, I don't know if they're going to survive it, but let's hope so. Now, I've got to cover a few domestic details. So if there is a fire, which I have not organized, the entrances are to the left and right. I could be an airline hostess there. The toilets are straight at the back of the Kirk. Okay. If I can be allowed to make a few personal reflections on Adam Smith, let me start by emphasizing I'm not a scholar of Adam Smith, nor do I claim to be an expert in any sense whatsoever. You will have the opportunity to hear from real experts during the next 2 days. However, I do perhaps represent an interested observer who cares deeply about the need to ensure the legacy of the Scottish Enlightenment, of which Adam Smith was a leading light, is better understood here at home. I've often heard people ask what Smith would have thought of current day economics or politics or social developments. For my part, I'm not really concerned with such speculation. I think we all should ask ourselves a much more reflective question. What can we learn from Adam Smith? The society he lived in was very different from how we live today, of course. Some suggest we live in a post-industrial society, while Smith lived in a pre-industrial society. Like most people, I use a car and fly to different destinations, something that would astonish those living in 18th century Scotland. We can speak to people using the latest technology rather than be dependent upon handwritten letters or face-to-face conversation and so on. Yet Smith and others of the Scottish Enlightenment can still speak to us and make us think. The importance of reason and the nature of the human condition are as relevant today as in Smith's time. What is it then that makes Smith's work of continuing relevance, of provoking us to think more clearly about our lives? I'm looking forward to hearing more on this over the course of the next few days. So how to start? Smith was deeply affected by his own education, including the educators he benefited from. He also contributed greatly to education, not merely as a writer in philosophy and economics, but as a teacher and as a professor at the University of Glasgow. I'm therefore enormously grateful that Dr. Craig Smith, himself a distinguished Adam Smith scholar, and Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, a distinguished economist in his own right and principal of the University of Glasgow, have agreed to lead this opening session on the very broad theme of education. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Craig Smith to make his opening remarks and to introduce more fully Professor Anton Muscatelli. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for the invitation to be here in Kirkcaldy as part of the 300th anniversary of Smith's birth. It's for an Adam Smith scholar. It's a wonderful thing to be able to be here and talk with you. I'll start with my usual disclaimer. My name is Craig Smith. I am no relation to Adam Smith, sadly. But you can tell people that you once heard someone called Smith in Kirkcaldy. We'll see if that works. Smith is one of these figures that everybody has heard of his name and sort of thinks they know what he thought. And one of the great things we've been trying to do, and also with our partners in Kirkcaldy and the Adam Smith Global Fund, we've been trying to get more people aware of what Smith said. And as Roger said there, Smith was committed to education. He was an educator. And he benefited from a first-class education. So it's, I think, entirely appropriate that we explore some of the themes that might emerge from Smith's work and how they connect to the idea of education as we experience it today. And it's a very good idea, I think, to think about that in a setting so close to the school that he once attended, and with some people from the university that he attended and then worked for. So I'm delighted to introduce, well, my boss, effectively, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli. Anton has been Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Glasgow since 2009. He is an economist whose research interests are monetary economics, central bank independence, fiscal policy, international finance, and macroeconomics. From 2007 to 2009, he was Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Heriot-Watt University. Prior to 2007, he held various roles at the University of Glasgow, including Vice Principal and Professor and Lecturer in the Department of Economics. Sir Anton was Chair from 2016 to 21 of the First Minister's Standing Council on Europe, a non-political group providing expert advice to the Scottish ministers on Scotland's relationship with the EU. He was a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisors from 2015 to 2021, and subsequently advised them on National Strategy for Economic Transformation. He's a member of the Advisory Group for Sir Paul Nurse's review of the UK's research, development, innovation and organisational landscape, and from 2017 to 2020, he was chair of the Russell Group of research-intensive universities. He's been a special advisor to the House of Commons, to politicians, to the European Commission and the World Bank, and has been leading the university through a period of change and innovation. So I'm delighted to welcome Sir Anton and ask him to talk to us about education and Adam Smith.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and Craig, thank you for that very kind introduction, and Roger as well for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here with you to speak to this audience and to be invited by the Adam Smith Global Foundation. And as Craig has already said, it's a particular pleasure for us to be here on behalf of the University of Glasgow. Obviously, it's fantastic to be here in Kirkcaldy because the Lang Toon was Smith's birthplace, and he's very much a son of Kirkcaldy, and it's I know he's held in great affection here, but he had incredible affection for his hometown. Of course, we like to also claim him as a son of Glasgow as well. I don't think these are two competing claims, and that's because he had just such a remarkable impact on our city and our university. We have a number of exciting events and programs to commemorate the tercentenary of Smith, not only this week, but in fact throughout the year. And again, on behalf of the university, you're very welcome to tune into our program of events. Some of these are actually online. We're also putting a special collection of materials in the form of a digital archive from Smith's era at Glasgow, and some of that again will be available both in person and online. And of course, you know, actually Adam Smith doesn't belong just to Kirkcaldy or to Glasgow. He belongs to the world as a whole, as your foundation's name suggests. And indeed, many of the events we've helped organize are not just based in Scotland, they're based across the world. And like myself in our institutions, there are many who feel very close affinity to Adam Smith. They're able to see the impact that he had as a scholar, as a citizen, and this morning, as we'll discuss, as an educator. And these reverberate through centuries. I'm actually really pleased that Craig is with us because he is the expert on Adam Smith. And again, a disclaimer on my part, and as you heard, I'm not a historian of economic thought, certainly not a specialist on Adam Smith, which is why it's great to have Craig with me to answer the difficult questions about what Smith actually taught. But of course, you know, Smith's first experience of education was here in the Borough School of Kirkcaldy, described by one of Smith's biographers, and I quote, as one of the best secondary schools of Scotland at that period. And he studied Latin, he studied maths, he studied writing and history here until the age of 13. And then he enrolled in the University of Glasgow, aged 14, under the tutelage of Francis Hutcheson, who himself was undertaking a campaign of reform of education at the university. Hutcheson believed that teaching should not just be in Latin to increase the accessibility of learning to students, and that the University of Glasgow should move away from the tradition that only the privileged went on to further studies. And this, I think this notion of accessibility of education was something that Smith carried with him and he wrote about in his own works. And I think the general consensus amongst Smith scholars is that Smith was in favor of a public contribution towards education, although obviously in the 18th century, that was only a discussion around the provision of primary, of basic school education. But in typical Smith fashion, I think he believes education should be governed by supply and demand. And in The Wealth of Nations, in Book 5, he says the following, and I quote, "Were there no public institutions for education, no system, no science would be taught for which there was not some demand." And I'll come back to some of this. So Smith largely supports the public provision of education in The Wealth of Nations with partial contributions from enrolled students. And when Smith was a student himself, he probably lived in university accommodation, which cost around £1 per year. He would have subsisted on around £5 per year and paid course fees of £3, 10 shillings. All of this around £10 per annum, which is probably about £3,000 in today's money, although indexation across the centuries is quite difficult, and it could have been more if you use a different indexation method. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith also argues for a universal education because he really does believe it will offset the harmful effects of the division of labour on the workers, which he, of course, was the centrepiece of his Wealth of Nations. And therefore, education had to be accessible to the workers. He sees the nature of the division of labour, which he describes in early industrial society as benumbing their understanding. That's the word he uses. And he instead argues education can occupy the minds of workers and encourage their sociality. He considers an educated workplace is, and I quote, "more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one." Now, the issue of skills formation, if I reflect where we are today, is, and the needs of the economy, is a topical issue for all government, not least the UK government, the Scottish government. Both prioritise the skills agenda as a means to drive economic growth and productivity, and especially at this time where we know that labour productivity in the UK has stagnated pretty much since the great financial crisis since 2008. And it's actually a problem that's impacted to a greater or lesser extent on many other Western economies. And of course, there's a role for universities here. We're helping to drive Scotland's productivity through equipping graduates with the skills needed for success in the modern economy. And indeed, Smith will have observed the transformation of Scotland's universities during his time as a student and a professor. Another colleague at the University of Glasgow, Chris Berry, notes the following. He says, "The presence of many universities in Scotland, given its population, was striking. In the 18th century, universities established new professorships in Scotland in law and medical schools, and there was an expansion into new subjects like chemistry and botany as part of the development of agriculture, of commerce and industry." So Scotland was at the forefront of that university development. And indeed then, as now, much of the knowledge that we transfer from universities to industry and commerce happens through the knowledge embedded in graduates who take up employment. That's the main way in which we transfer our knowledge. And these spillover effects from human capital formation to the productivity of business and industry, they're not easy to measure, But we know that whenever I speak as principal to many SMEs and local companies that talk about how their productivity is enhanced, they talk about the people they hire with the skills from our universities. It's absolutely key to our innovation activities in Scotland. Productivity growth is complex. It's difficult to understand all the mechanisms, and there's been a very active debate in recent years as to what the underlying causes of the recent slowdown. But what we will all tend to agree on as economists is that productivity depends on the development of human capital. And indeed, we know that Smith's view on the division of labour and the development of specialised skills were similar, though of course from a very different era. Again, if I go back to what Chris Berry notes in his introduction to Adam Smith, he saw the division of labour as potentially impacting negatively on workers through the repetitive nature of factory tasks. Smith talks about the loss of the habit of exertion can lead to the torpor of the mind, as he describes it. And the remedy that Smith argues for is education. It's using the Scottish example where public funds were being used to establish parish schools. Smith believed that in such schools, children will be taught for a fee that, quotes, even a common labourer may afford. He believes strongly that there should be a curriculum covering basic literacy and elementary mathematics. We've heard some of this recently as well. We need a productive and efficient workforce to drive GDP, but in doing so, we mustn't leave behind those marginalized groups in our society. Now, in economics, there is evidence that labour productivity and thus overall output could be improved also by increasing worker well-being. And much of this relates to the need for a workforce that is informed, it's equipped with all of its necessary skills, as well as the opportunity to build on those skills and learn throughout their working life, lifelong learning, as we call it now. And there are echoes of this in the Wealth of Nations as well, where it's argued that high wages encourage in the worker, again, I quote, the hope of, quote, bettering his condition. So, for example, in our just transition to net zero over the next 10 years, which are absolutely critical to us having a transition to net zero, we'll see much more of an emphasis on digital innovation, on green and clean technologies. But that will have to that requires a need for Scotland to upskill workers continuously to support those who have already been through education and need to be upskilled in these new technologies. We've actually seen a shortage, as we know, in recent months of skilled workers in a number of sectors. And I know Roger spoke about this during his time as an MP, partly because many of the workers who came from the EU in skilled sectors, some of them have returned to their own country. So we must also look to strengthen our own domestic pipeline of skilled workers, not only in terms of those we've lost through Brexit, but also in terms of shoring up the pipeline of workers needed for the technologies which are going to drive clean, green, inclusive growth. And the discussion of skills in recent years has also included a debate on the provision of apprenticeships across various fields and the role for colleges and universities to move more into that apprenticeship field. Now, it might interest you to know that this issue actually also troubled Smith. He observed in the book 1 of the Wealth of Nations that apprenticeships, and of course, slightly different notion of apprenticeships then, but he said that these are part of the market process and they are not the responsibility of the sovereign, but they are controlled by the guilds. And while Smith agrees with this, he insists that the traditional apprenticeship structures that existed in his time needed reform, noting that they are, and I quote, the epitome of the restrictions of the principles of competition and liberty. And he goes on to say that during the continuance of the apprenticeship, the whole labour of the apprentice belongs to his master. So worrying about asymmetry of power there. Now, for us, the success of the skills agenda will also hinge not only on the quantity of education provision, but the quality of education too. And Smith echoed these sentiments. And much of his commentary in the Wealth of Nations about education are dominated by concerns about quality. He unsurprisingly makes a series of market-based recommendations for education, as I mentioned. I noted his reference to apprenticeship reform, but Smith, ever in favour of competition, also sees competition as a means to improving teaching and teacher quality. He complains about the laziness of tutors who are too secure in their jobs, and he makes an askance reference to his colleagues at Balliol College, Oxford, who had given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. Now, he never made that comment about colleagues at Glasgow, but take that what you will. I think actually he did have views about the incentives impacting on academics. Now, Coming back to the 20th, 21st century on quality versus quantity of education, Harvard economist Robert Barrow conducted a study in 2013 using data from richer and poorer OECD countries to evaluate the correlation between economic growth and education. And he used data on students' test scores on internationally comparable examinations in science, mathematics, and reading to measure the quality of schooling. And he found that scores on science tests are a particularly strong predictor of economic growth. And whilst he found quantity of schooling is still positively related to subsequent growth, the effect of quality in education is statistically much more significant. So quality does matter. And to improve the quality of education and support a drive for upskilling and reskilling, there has to be sustained and long-term public investment. Now, I'm not going to rehash here the arguments about funding for higher and further education, which are playing out at the moment across the UK, not only in Scotland, or indeed across Europe, actually. But what I will say is that another reason for investing in education publicly is the point that if technological progress, and I'll come back to this in a moment, if technological progress is skills biased, as economists say, i.e. it tends to favor those with more advanced skills as imparted by longer periods of education, that actually, if we don't invest in education, there's the potential to increase socioeconomic inequality. Something, of course, Smith would argue ardently against. And there's really strong evidence on this. US economists Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz argued that one of the reasons we've seen more inequality in many advanced countries since the 1980s, their original study was on the US, but it's been reproduced across other countries, has been the slowing down of the mass upskilling in their study of the US population. That came in post-1945 in the US through universal, not only free secondary education, but also very accessible and affordable college education. And that delivered a period of between 1945 and the 1980s, roughly, when human capital growth matched technological advancement in the US and across the OECD, and that reduced economic inequality. So the technological change which drives growth can cause income inequality if those higher level skills find their wage rising, leaving others behind. And so as Smith suggests, I think education must be accessible to all workers, particularly if the end goal is the mitigation of poverty or inequality. Now, however, there are contrary views here, and actually there's been quite a debate in the UK at the moment around the over-provision of higher education. For instance, Baroness Alison Wolfe, in her book, Does Education Matter? Myths About Education and Economic Growth, argues that governments, particularly Tony Blair's New Labour, saw education as an economic panacea, as an engine for growth and prosperity. And she questions whether there's been an overemphasis on the role of university education and strategies for economic growth at the expense of more vocational education. I've debated this with Alison many times, but she casts doubt on the evidence of the graduate wage premium, contrary to much of the evidence in the UK, which shows actually that the graduate wage premium, the amount that people earn above what you might call school leaving, those with school leaving qualifications, it's actually been quite resilient to increasing numbers going into higher education. But again, much of this depends on what happens in terms of skills-based technological change, which I mentioned earlier. And there's certainly concern, I think, that rapid technological change could lead to a dramatic substitution away from labor towards capital through new technologies like AI or digital tech. Some of you may have seen that a book was published about 2 or 3 weeks ago by MIT economists Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. It's called Power and Progress, the 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. I would actually certainly recommend it. It's a really interesting issue about how prosperity and technology interact. And whilst Adam Smith argued clearly and compellingly in The Wealth of Nations that capital investment, i.e. better machines, would lead to higher real wages automatically through productivity, Acemoglu and Johnson question whether that's always true and inevitable. They ask whether in the 21st century, with a very different nature of technological change that we face, we might not see such a benign correlation. And indeed, we know that even in the case of development of the factory and the commercial society in the 19th and 20th century, there were periods when the return to capital exceeded the returns to labor. Now, Acemoglu and Johnson argue that new ways of organizing production and communication can either serve the narrow interests of the elite or they can become the foundation for widespread prosperity. There's a choice there, and they evaluate the role of technical innovation in driving productivity, like Smith in his study of the plow and the corn mill. Now, earlier this week, on Monday, we were very privileged to host Geeta Gopinath, who's first managing director of the IMF at the university, and she shared her perspective on what Smith might have taught of technologies like AI and the perils and powers of these. And I would say, hopefully it will be available online soon, and I hope you have a chance to see that. Acemoglu and Johnson argue very compellingly that the path of technology was once and can again be brought under control for the benefit of the majority and not the few. And the key forces that they say will drive a more balanced and equitable benefit are linked to the developments in democracy, which distributed political and social power much more widely in the 19th and 20th century than in the 18th century of Smith. They argue that it's the role of robust institution which matters. And I'm going to quote one phrase from their book. Also critical were institutions and norms for robust strength sharing in workplaces, ensuring that higher productivity is translated into wage growth. So let me take this important challenge by Acemoglu and Johnson and cover two more points in relation to education, linking this back to Adam Smith's perspectives. First, and very briefly, as this is not really a subject which concerns Smith very much, since given the different nature of technological change in early industrial society, we really should think carefully about how 21st century technological development impacts on labor substitution. We should perhaps focus more on what Acemoglu and Johnson called the development of machine usefulness. It's a really good expression, machine usefulness. So fields such as human-computer interaction, instruments such as virtual and augmented reality, which improve human capabilities in fields such as design and planning, are a good example of this. Another good example is the development of tech in areas such as health, which enhance the diagnostic expertise of doctors, of nurses, of health workers. This is not about replacing doctors, nurses, workers. It's about enhancing their capabilities. And this makes them more effective and more productive, but it also means you do not substitute away from labor. And actually, it's really quite interesting because Smith's discussion of all this in The Wealth of Nations is all about how the improvement of machines came from the division of labor. So there's an interesting debate here about all the causal links in this area of work. My second point is that given the potential for major technological change in the 21st century in fields as varied as AI, net zero, quantum, modern medicine, it seems to me that countries cannot afford not to invest publicly in advanced skills. And if anything, 21st century technological development will be even more skills biased than what we've seen in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. In the 20th century, we saw the development of electrical, chemical engineering, aviation, electronics, lasers, and that was matched by investment, as I said, post-1945. And like Smith argued with the plow or the mill, it's the owners of these machines or technologies who will benefit from productivity, not the workers, unless we invest in skills, unless we avoid this exploitation of technological innovation by balancing it through public investment. And I know you actually heard you mention earlier that you had former Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls discussing some of these issues. And it's interesting because he's done a study recently with some colleagues in the US, how targeting STEM education might be a key to leveling up the UK, Scotland, and bringing prosperity, especially in those areas where the economy is lagging behind. And these views are aligned with Adam Smith's interest in what the Scots called improvement and the practical application of science and technology to improve the lives of the population. Now, beyond the practical use for education and driving economic growth, Smith was, of course, also a philosopher. He provides his moral reasoning for the need and for universal and public education. He argues an education population are, and I quote, more disposed to examine, more capable of seeing through the interested complaints of faction and sedition, and they are, upon that account, less apt to be misled into any wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. Now, Smith believed that if a people in a country are more educated, they'll be less likely to be taken in by the notion of what perhaps he saw as radical politics. And he believed this is because people will have the skills necessary to think for themselves and to see the errors in other people's reasoning. But perhaps I would challenge this view slightly to say that certainly for universities today, we need to remain an open space for debate and critique of government. Often it is universities that can drive change in government. Our sectoral values of integrity and truth demand that we take this responsibility seriously, particularly when we see the stoking of division. Just give you the example of policies against migrants or refugees. And of course, our students are often at the heart of driving political change of more radical politics, particularly in recent years with the youth climate strike and calling out issues of social injustice. And I believe that these are hugely important causes. Smith himself was a champion for students. He was a champion for student causes. He was concerned that the discipline of colleges and universities was for the ease of the masters, people like myself and Craig. Whilst a professor at the University of Glasgow, he supported and raised funds for a new university library, for a printing press, an Academy of Fine Arts, and each of these would have brought enrichment to the lives of students on our campuses. In assessing Smith's theory of moral sentiments, there's also a fairly broad consensus that Smith viewed education as going beyond books or practical experience and should include the learning of wisdom and moral sentiments as central to a prosperous and flourishing society. And again, perhaps Smith took a page out of Francis Hutcheson's book, because when Smith was a student at Glasgow, Hutcheson would supplement the classical authors with modern thinkers, adding Grotius, Pufendorf, John Locke, and Mandeville to the moral philosophy curriculum. And Hutcheson more generally argued for freedom of expression. And Smith also saw social learning as a means of education. That's to say, learning between friends, acquaintances, and parents and children. He argued children should be educated through accessible and inexpensive parish schools, as I said, with adults receiving some form of lifelong education through religious institutions, civic institutions, and events. He believed an educated population less susceptible to religious fanaticism. And philosopher Jack Russell Weinstein suggests Smith found religious factions were highly pernicious. To say this in a church, but because they perceived their denominational precepts as superseding human laws, morality, and the rules of justice. And as an antidote, he says Smith recommended mandating those of middling rank and fortune to be required to study science and philosophy. Now, Smith was not anti-religion, but his goal was to support moderate religious belief and avoid any form of sectarian extremism. Now, one caveat to note, of course, in all this is that in Smith's era, the focus of education of the population was, of course, merely the education of men and boys. And in The Wealth of Nations, in discussing public works and institutions, Smith touches briefly on this issue. And I'm going to read you a long quote, but I think it is important. There are no public institutions for the education of women, and there is accordingly nothing useless, absurd, or fantastical in the common course of their education. They are taught what their parents or guardians judge it necessary and useful for them to learn, and they are taught nothing else. Every part of their education tends evidently to some useful purpose, either to improve the natural attractions of their person or to form their minds to reserve, to modesty, to chastity, and to economy, and to behave properly. In every part of our life, a woman leads some conveniency or advantage from every part of her education. It seldom happens that a man in any part of his life drives any conveniency or advantage for some of the most laborious and troublesome part of his education. Wealth of Nations, Book 2. Now, read in isolation, this passage is very jarring to us as a 21st century audience. It seems to convey a low esteem of women, focusing as it does on women's limited place in 18th century society. However, actually, this passage is much more about Smith's attack on the usefulness, or lack of it, of the education system for men. It's part of the argument I mentioned earlier in my talk about the need for public education reform. And in the discussion, I really would be interested to hear the audience take on this, given that so little is known about what Smith might have thought about the education offering for women if he had lived today, given that we are a panel of 3 men here on the stage. Now, let me give you my view that, for starters, I think that given Smith's analytical skills, if he'd lived in the 20th or 21st century, he would, without a doubt, have embraced the importance of equality in education across gender and across protected characteristics. His reflections on the importance of education and society transcended social class. He emphasized social cohesion, and without a doubt in my mind, he would have been a champion of gender equality in education if he'd lived in our times. So overall, one could argue that Smith viewed education as requiring a holistic approach, nurturing the academic and intellectual development of citizens and workers, but equally encompassing experiential, spiritual, social, philosophical elements too. And I would argue this is the goal for us as societies today, to provide a well-rounded quality learning experience for our students so that we can create good global citizens who will support Scotland, or indeed the whole world, to flourish. And like Smith, we must continue to champion education and lifelong learning as a means to facilitate social mobility. We must uphold the values of integrity and inclusivity. And we must continue to be engines of change and growth, supporting the upskilling of the population, but in doing so, ensuring we do not widen inequalities. We must harness the technologies with the most potential to drive productivity. But again, this must be for the public gain. This must be not solely for the benefit of private pockets. And again, it's important for us to reflect on how technologies impact on labor and how we foster technological paths which serve humanity. They don't destroy the usefulness of labor. So I do wish sometimes that we could teleport back to the 1700s, or indeed teleport Smith to the present, simply because there's so many unanswered questions in regards to Smith's remarks on education. But we know that he was tied to education throughout his life, as Craig and Roger mentioned. He was a student, he was a teacher, he was a professor, he was a private tutor. The Wealth of Nations was drafted as he followed and tutored the Duke of Buccleuch across France. The Theatre of Moral Sentiments was presented as first as lectures to his students at the University of Glasgow. And it wouldn't be too perverse, as Smith might say, to think that he would have a thing or two to say about what we're doing in education these days. And as I said in our discussions just before the lecture began, I think the beauty and frustration of Smith's work is his nuance as he challenges us to think about different angles of an argument. Smith's comments on education are definitely not as complete or robust as we might like, but they provide a compelling basis from which we can evaluate our own actions today. There's much that remains to be explored. I really hope that we have an interesting discussion with your questions. And let me hand back to Craig, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Anton. That was very thought-provoking, and in a moment or two we'll maybe have a little conversation and then have some questions from the floor to explore some of the themes there. I think we both referred to the fact that Smith was educated here in Kirkcaldy and then at Glasgow, and I think it's interesting that he benefited from what at the time was a very innovative education in both places. So, you know, the schoolmaster in Kirkcaldy in the 18th century was a man called David Miller, who taught Adam Smith, and he was actually poached from Cooper because he ran the school in Cooper and it had a great reputation. So the borough of Kirkcaldy offered him more money and brought him down here to teach in the borough school. And one of the things that I love of the story about this is that one of his innovative teaching methods was something which I think has come back into education today, which is by getting students to participate. So he would put on little plays and readings and make the students adopt the role of a character in a novel or in the Spectator magazine and pretend or read out the passages that they found there. And it's the title of one of these little plays that I thought might share with you, which is wonderful. It's A Royal Council for Advice or Regular Education for Boys, the Foundation of All Other Improvements. Now, that's quite a title. As Anton was saying there, we might want to change the boys aspect of that, but A Royal Council for Advice or Regular Education, the Foundation for Improvement for All. And I think that's a theme that's emerged from what you were saying, Anton. So it seems that was something Smith was educated in as well. That was the message that he was getting, that education could make a difference. But of course, this is the 18th century. And one of the things we're talking about there was technology and how that's changed. And I wonder if we might just start with a little kind of reflection on that, because even in a very short period of time, what it is to be a student or a school pupil has been transformed by laptops and Google and phones. And I wonder, Anton, have you noticed a change in the way that the education's existed in that way?
So absolutely, and of course, both of us in different ways have come through that period of rapid change. And in fact, again, it might interest you, it's actually, we're changing the physical spaces where we teach in Glasgow to respond to this. So one of the things we are trying to do is we're trying as much as possible, we're not abandoning lectures, because lectures can still be very useful ways of communicating to a very large number of people, but we are increasingly
encouraging our colleagues to engage in what, in our parlance in 21st century, is called active learning, which is essentially saying, we're not going to spend all the time telling you, imparting information to you as students. It's partly about you actually engaging with material. So we've tried to encourage a number of our schools and departments to think about changing the way in which they teach. Of course, still use the lecture when you have to impart a certain amount of knowledge, but even within lecture, pause, use some time for discussion, using modern technologies. And many of these active learning spaces actually are very technology heavy. There will be a room in which there are 8 tables, each holding, say, 5 or 6 chairs, but it will have technology in the center, which will be used to share with each other's in the group, but also should share with other groups. So it really is incredibly exciting. I have to say, when I started lecturing, technology was only beginning to come into play with things like the use of kind of technology quizzes, which you could then, quizzes driven by technology, whereby you could have instant feedback on questions that you could ask a tutorial. That was really at the very beginning of my time. And now it's incredible what you can do. You can actually have mixed virtual reality. You can, somebody who teaches history of art can actually demonstrate in 3D an object that sits in a museum, not here in Scotland, but somewhere in Berlin or in Cairo or whatever. It's really fantastic what technology can do for teaching. And I do think, again, as you say, universities really have a duty to try and bring that best practice, because it's more interactive. And actually, I do think that's exactly what modern society needs. It needs that ability to think actively, to think critically, and to engage with material, not simply to sit and absorb.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I've also noticed about precisely this, is that we lecturers have to learn to use this technology, but our students already know how to use this technology. So you can be sitting in one of these rooms and think, right, I'm going to use the technology to make a point, and I'll kind of look at it, and then the student will go, you want to press that button, and show you how to do it. But that's interesting as well, because that picks up another theme that you were talking about there, Anton, which is the notion that there is a set of skills that are embedded now in the way that we educate, that are forward-looking in a sense. They're looking about how changes to technology and to the way that we do things are to be anticipated by the students. I just wonder if do you think there's anything in particular that we should look to in that area?
So we've used, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting, Craig, because of course we've used all sorts of metaphors in universities in the last 10, 20 years. One, for instance, metaphor, which has been, I think was originally launched by Georgia Tech in the US, was the notion of a T-shaped graduate. So what you want is somebody who has disciplinary depth, but also has a breadth of skills across different types of skills, cognitive and non-cognitive skills, actually, not just, Now, I think that's sometimes a bit simplistic, because in reality, probably in certain new areas, take AI or machine learning, you need probably, it's less of a T and much more of a pie. You need a couple of deep roots into different disciplines. And we are constantly looking, for instance, in our curriculum, where existing disciplines are a barrier, and we should go for more multiple disciplines. I mean, I think that's natural. I mean, I keep saying to people, computing science didn't exist as an academic discipline until the 1950s. So, and now, of course, people would say, of course, it's a discipline in all our universities. So why should we rule out the possibility that we start having other hybrid disciplines that develop? So I think that's natural. But I do think also what we need to think of is some breadth around different kinds of cognitive skills, not all of them necessarily related to the discipline that one learns in a university. So that's one element. And the other element is this offering breadth also through other skills. For instance, we offer at Glasgow micro-credentials, and that's jargon for essentially, it's a course that you can do, which is not part formally of your curriculum. It's optional at the moment. It's online. often because, because we want to make it available as widely as possible on things like climate literacy, on things like net zero, because, we think all of our students should learn about these things. So increasingly, I think we will have to offer things like that to round off an education, give our students those opportunities. And then hopefully even after they've left to come back and take some of these micro-credential courses.
One of the other things you touched on was the need for universities to be places which pursue truth, which has always been part of the kind of the mission of what a university is about. And sometimes we seem to be living through a time where there are very contested views about particular issues and how they are discussed in a university. And I wonder if you have any reflections on how that's impacted on the way the university interacts with students and with wider social and political ideas.
It's really, really tricky, Craig. It's one of the most, I think if there are working in the universities is really a privilege and a pleasure. I have to tell you, it really is. But this is one of the areas where I don't think things are necessarily moving in the right direction. Not because anybody's doing anything particularly wrong, but because I think there's just so much more intolerance about other people's opinions in society. So we are often having, I have had a number of occasions, certainly in our university, where some group wanted to have a meeting to discuss about something which is perfectly within the law. So it's not about hate, it doesn't involve hate speech, doesn't sit outside the law. So in my view, everything that sits within the law, providing you don't breach the hate speech legislation or discrimination legislation, you should actually be able to discuss this in a university. If you can't discuss it in a university, where can you discuss it? But there's sometimes a real intolerance, an attempt to stop other people from saying what they want to say, which is entirely legitimate. It's always a feeling, and it's something we need to do something about this in our education to tell people that that's not how you allow your own line of argument to be to prevail over another line of argument. That has to be a contested space. It has to be a space where you say, well, you say this, but I say that. At the moment, there is still a tendency, and it does happen with our students as well as our colleagues sometimes, that people say, no, this shouldn't be heard in our university. And I think freedom of speech is just such an important value for universities. We need to make sure it happens. Easier said than done, because occasionally people will use, the mechanism of protest to stop things from being said or being heard. And it's really, really tricky. So whenever this has happened in Glasgow, I've certainly tried my very best to meet opposing sides to say, like, why don't you want this being heard? I promise you, we'll give you an opportunity for your side to be heard, but please do let them go ahead and have their meeting to discuss X. You will absolutely have a moment to discuss your view. You know how I feel about Brexit. When I was asked by the Leave vote campaign whether Nigel Farage could come and speak at the University of Glasgow, I said, absolutely, we want Nigel Farage to come and speak. I'm not happy with what he has to say, but he has to come to speak at the University of Glasgow, for goodness sake, especially in a university like ours where 99% of our students and staff believed in Remain. So that's a bit of a convoluted answer, but you see where I think we need to uphold freedom of speech in universities.
Well, in the spirit of freedom of speech, I'd like to open it up to see if we have any questions from the floor, to encourage anyone who'd like to ask Anton anything about the themes. Yeah. Oh, hang on, we've got a mic for you. We've got a mic for you. That might be easier. Yeah. Hi. Oh. Hello. Oh, are you going? It's on now. Yeah, should be. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not bad.
Try now.
You hear me? You hear what I'm saying, Jim?
Oh. Try now. Hello. Oh.
I'm in the new button.
Try.
Hello, can you hear me?
Well successful.
Okay, I'll start again. David Miller.
Mhm.
So David Miller from Cooper, we poached him, we put pressure on him for the Oswald family to get him here.
Mhm.
And he delivered a curriculum that was extensive with rhetoric and encouraged people to get moving on. He did the plays, and the plays weren't just about showing how well the kids were doing, they were also about getting money from the parents and getting them to pay more into the school, and there's a lot of money came locally to try and do that. So the education was there. He'd be on a 14-hour day education program, probably, supported by his mother. But his education, his formal education, obviously was excellent, and then he went on to Glasgow University, etc. But his social education and learning was done locally. Now, I'm wondering what your take is on what the environment was then that allowed him to come up with so many good ideas. We know that through the Royal Borough status, with Charles I, we became international trading, have an international trading ability locally in the ports. So his dad was over in 1720 to be the comptroller. So that was that. He could see the ships going backwards and forwards for international trade. He had some good people around him. But I'm just wondering what discussions locally might have happened before he went on his grand tour, etc., that might have helped him to form such definitive ideas about how society became interwoven together, and then later he added political economy to that as well.
Perhaps, yes, I'll say a little about that. I think it is interesting to think about this this social side to the education that Anton's mentioned. This idea that yes, you're educated formally in a classroom as he was by Miller just over the road, but you're also talking and interacting with the people that you're at school and you're at university with and who live in the town, and that's part of your education. And one of the things that often strikes me about Adam Smith's early education in the borough school here is the fact that it was a very small school, but in his class, you had someone who went on to be the moderator of the Church of Scotland, perhaps the most famous British architect of the 18th century, and someone who became a high-ranking cabinet minister. So a very small class with 4 what I take to be very big personalities in it. So I think that's part of where these people come from. So one of the great things about working at the university is that you get to spend a lot of time with very smart people, both the students and the professors, and that gives you a kind of social education that goes beyond the formal education.
And it's interesting, I can't remember the precise quote, but wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who talked about when he visited Scotland? What struck him is just the level of education that generally that he would encounter in people he would meet in the street. It would be really high level, which again shows you the external, I suppose what economists in jargon call the externalities of education. It's not just the benefit to the individual, but what it creates in terms of society as a whole. And I think maybe, again, this is an argument we don't make enough, certainly as educators, to say, look, this is another reason why you should invest in education at all levels, because it actually creates, you know, a much better environment for all, actually creates a better society.
Good question at the front here, if we could pass the light down. Oh.
It was just to take a different example, rather than a happy example of Adam Smith. Lord Henry Cockburn of the memorials of his time had a less happy experience. Tutored until he was sent off on his 8th birthday to the Royal High School in Edinburgh to a class of 100, and then spent 4 years of boredom and terror, being sort of Latin being sort of flogged into him. He flogged every 10 days or so, he reckoned. And only in the last 2 years, when he was on the class of the rector, that they got something of, you know, sufficient education to make the rector an object of suspicion with his love for Republican Rome. But it's just so, it must be quite hard from the point of view of teaching in a university, the range of education that the students had. Some very limited, some very well taught. I think they didn't have quite such a high success rate with the 100 people in the first class of the Royal High School as Kirkcaldy did. Perhaps small is beautiful.
I think that's a very good point, and I guess that's still true today. Some schools are better at others at preparing students, and I think one of the things certainly I've noticed is that we are a very international university, and so you can't take for granted that the students in your seminar will have done the subjects in the Scottish high school curriculum. You have to be more creative about it. You have to think about that, and that in itself is another strength, because people bring different experiences from education into the classroom, some happier than others. And I think that's one of the interesting things about it.
It's actually really tricky, and often when again Craig referred to the fact that we draw students from around the world, and is often knowing exactly what they have studied. In fact, I was just speaking to somebody about how do you create standardized tests, and then to look at whether people have got the prerequisites come in. Having said all that, I mean, again, let me give you a positive line on all this. I used to, well, I'm an economist, I taught economics, but one of the things that's important in economics is some degree of mathematical and statistical knowledge. And in second year, we used to do classes for those who hadn't done any maths at school. You know, they often didn't just not have a higher in maths, but they didn't have even what at that stage was no grade, but would be known as a national exam and national 5 exam in maths. And you know, that might sound dispiriting, but it isn't actually. In many respects, actually, it's quite empowering, because you can actually quickly bring up people to speed on skills where they come in with different qualifications, different knowledge bases. And sometimes you'd be surprised. Some of my best students were ones who hadn't come with a higher maths, but we were quickly bringing them up to that level. The one advantage of universities is that people want to be there generally. Well, if they don't, they tend to leave within a matter of weeks. Those who want to be there genuinely are keen to learn. So actually, we can cope with unevenness in school education. Not that I would argue that that's a good thing, by the way. I think we do need more evenness in school education.
Okay, George, there's no idea at the front. Thank you. Oh, just there, George. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Two quick questions, one very practical, which is, you know, we've always known that Scotland was way ahead in universal education, ironically because of the churches a lot of the time. But one of the things I've realised I've never questioned is, was it unusual for him to have gone to university at 14, or was that normal at that stage? The broader question comes back to your point, Anton, about STEM subjects and engineering and the like. And I can remember when I first got involved in this skills debate 30 odd years ago, hearing someone from Shell saying, when we're recruiting software engineers, we don't want computer science graduates. We want folk that have studied Chinese civilization or philosophy, because they want them to think differently. And we've always celebrated that we educated the lad of Pearts, if you excuse the gender specific. But are we losing something by becoming so focused on the technical subjects and not the breadth, the culture, the socials, the humanities? Because that helps them be rounded individuals and probably more creative than just learning how to be computer scientists.
Yeah, I'll do the first bit. 14 wasn't unusual at the time. There are records of some who were even younger than him starting at the university. So it wasn't a prodigy in that sense. Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think STEM subjects are important. I always, again, economist jargon, but I think some degree of STEM education is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for us to be able to have an education system fit for purpose. In fact, to balance out the STEM argument, I always like to say that, and again, this is just anecdotal from my experience at university, the students who I found were best coming to us are those who have studied in systems that are actually very broad, that have that mathematics ability. Mathematics, it's not just not STEM generally, mathematics and literacy. So if you go to most other continental European countries, you'll find that most of them tend to encourage study of both the national language in quite formal ways, literacy, and mathematics to the age of 18. And that actually serves, I think, serves quite well. Yes, I'm not just pro STEM. In fact, I always like to give the example that if you look at leadership across the world in business or industry, 50% of those are graduates in arts, humanities, and social sciences. And that's not a coincidence. So critical thinking, which is what arts, humanities, and social sciences give you, is just as important as technical subjects. In reality, we need both, you know, and you know, if anybody comes to me for advice about what to do at university, I would say, and this is again an advantage of the Scottish curriculum as opposed to the English university curriculum, where you tend to study one subject for 3 years, 3 or 4 years. In Scotland, it's 4 or 5 years, depending. It is a broader curriculum. You have a choice, and I'd say, you know, broaden it out. Do some things on the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and do some things which are much more scientifically based, and that gives you a really good basis for going forward.
Realize, as a volunteer at university, I studied linguistics and maths. The one subject I had to do under duress, which was probably the most useful in the long run, was philosophy. I had to do a philosophy course.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. In a sense, my question follows on from Esther's and the response that you've given, really, which is, I mean, I suppose one of the most common misunderstandings of Adam Smith is that people are not always aware of how deeply rooted his economic thinking was in, of course, moral sentiment and, you know, social cohesion and solidarity. And I mean, in relation to education, I mean, we've just been talking about the STEM subjects, and obviously, I mean, particularly within the political world, when you talk about education, there's an enormous impulse because of the outcome-driven nature of politics as well as economics to focus on functionality, the technocratic aspect, the technical aspect. Within the disciplines that deal with that, what room or capacity is there for moral imagination, for moral sentiment, and for moral thinking? I think that goes a little bit further than just thinking about the humanities and the balance and so on, because, you know, we are living in a world at the moment where business as usual has led us to the point of an actual existential crisis and so on. So we're going to need to do some unlearning as well as learning, and that's going to require deep imagination as well as a grasp of the sort of technical skills that are going to be necessary to tackle things like climate change.
Fascinating question, and I can't say this is a course which all, or this is a body of knowledge which all we impart to all university students which take them in that direction. As I mentioned, the fact that it used to be compulsory to do, if you're an arts student, to do a course in philosophy. No matter what your final student study is. I'll try and give you a slightly sort of oblique way into this, though. I mean, I mentioned earlier what we're trying to do around issues around climate literacy, looking at the wider environment. It was interesting. It's been interesting to me. We, as a university, of course, are a major research university in Scotland. Research is really important to us as well as teaching. We have these exercises every 6 to 7 years, which evaluate the research across all Scottish universities. And for the first time in 2021, we were ranked top in Scotland in terms of our overall grade point average, which is great. But what's interesting to me is that if I talk to our colleagues and to our students, they care about that, but they care about the impact that we are having on the world. So it's interesting. So things like, you know, we recently for instance, ended up being ranked 13th in the world this week, actually, in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which look at how we contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so again, top in Scotland, second in the UK. And that's about projects, evaluating projects that we do at student or indeed as research that impact on the UN 17 SDGs. Initially, we did it simply as a way of projecting what we do onto this. So it's pretty much one way. We do what we do, and then here you are, this is a projection on the SDGs. I've been amazed actually over the last 12 months, 2 years when we've been engaging in this, and actually it's now completely reversed. It's driving strategy because people are coming forward and saying, I care about what I'm doing, whether it's because I'm studying this subject or researching this subject as a colleague. And I care about what I'm going to do with this research, or I care about this project which is related to my learning or my research, and this is how it's impacting on my community, it's impacting the world. So it's different. It's not a course. It's not a body of knowledge we're trying to impart. But I'm seeing much more kind of engagement with what you might call values, what you might call the impact that universities have. So that gives me optimism that actually we might be doing something which is simply goes. It's not just functional, as you said, or very oriented to impart a particular skill in a course or in the research that we do. This is about societal impact, and I think we have to do this, and I think it's something that we will continue doing. But it's a really good question. Should we think about imparting some of this in a more structured way through micro-credentials? Good question.
Lady here.
Hello, I'm wondering how much Smith's views on education would have been affected by the difference of the education in Scotland, where the sons of the wealthy families and the lairds might have found themselves sitting next to the lad o' perts, the labourers' sons, compared to in his brief time in England. He would have seen that the English would be very wary about educating the poorer classes, the working classes, looking across the channel at the unrest in France. And would he have been aware of it in his travels through France in the years leading up to the revolution, that education there was to be frowned on except in the elite? So would he have found himself sitting next to poorer kids, boys? I'm wondering, were any girls educated? Because surely the girls were expected to help to manage their future husbands' trades as part of the family enterprises. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great one for you, Craig.
That's a really interesting question, especially about the education of girls at this time, because many of the borough schools did admit girls for the primary education to ensure literacy, but there was very much not so much a glass ceiling as an absolute ceiling that they would be, once the very basic education had been provided, they wouldn't be educated, and they would have been educated probably in a separate class from the boys at a different time of day. That said as well, a lot of women wouldn't, a lot of more traditional families would not have sent their girls to school in any case, and would have educated them at home. And that kind of relates to the point that you quoted, Anton, about what women were taught. They were taught what their parents thought would be useful to them, which might be very different from what they wanted to they wanted to learn. So that's absolutely true. Yes, absolutely on the class, the mix of people from different class backgrounds. There is a kind of caveat that you can add to that kind of restriction, and that is that the very wealthy didn't send their children to the borough school. The very wealthy had tutors, and Smith indeed ended up as a tutor to the Duke of Buccleuch. But yes, the emerging middle classes, upper middle classes, and the workers, their children would be educated together. And I think that will. It's interesting. One of the themes that our speaker at the university last night, Professor Deirdre McCloskey, touched on was that what made the 18th century in Scotland so interesting and so revolutionary was that they removed barriers between people. The sense of equality that developed then was not necessarily that everybody ended up equal or started off equal, but a lot of the barriers, access to education was genuinely equal, and so that was a new thing. and a very specific, as you mentioned, the comparison with England, that was a very specifically Scottish thing. The idea that you could advance through the class, that you could go to university, was something which didn't have any kind of class barrier to it. So many towns, I'm sure this borough was the same, would have had a bursary to send a bright child from the local school to the nearest university. And that bursary would not be given on the basis of class, but on the basis of aptitude. So I think that is something that was different about the education system in Scotland that Smith passed through, that it was genuinely attempting to be universal and genuinely attempting to be more egalitarian. I won't say egalitarian because of the strictures placed on women, absolutely, but more egalitarian than elsewhere.
Postscript on gender equality in higher education. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me. I originally was born in southern Italy, and so my parents grew up there, and actually, I mean, if we lament how long it took to get gender equality here, my mother's generation was pretty much not quite where Craig, the kind of situation Craig described, but very few of them were able to stay at school beyond the age of 14. And simply, you know, my mother couldn't do that, even though she was very keen to go to school. Her parents would say, no, that's simply not necessary. And it's one of the reasons, actually, I suppose, where I'm very passionate about gender equality in education, is because this is living memory as far as I'm concerned, that my mother's generation, my aunts, etc., they were basically, even though they were academically able, were simply told, sorry, that's it for you. So.
Yes, I'm wondering, do we know anything about Adam Smith's mastery of foreign languages? Do we know, for example, did he receive formal education, training in French particularly? Did he read Voltaire's Candide in the original? And then secondly, I was thinking about the position of foreign languages, foreign language skills and so on in university education now and in the forthcoming years. I'd be very interested to hear if there are plans to go on changing and developing the ways in which foreign languages and the cultures and literature connected there, are taught in our universities.
On the Smith side of it, on the biographical side, yes, Smith was fluent in, Ryan will probably add to this list if you can, Latin, ancient Greek, French, Italian, German, I think he had a little bit. I'm not quite sure about that. But yes, he was absolutely multilingual, and his library is in a number of different languages. And we know that he may have started that at a very early age because his father, as is well known, his father died before he was born. But we know what his father had in his library, and his father spoke French. So his father has a list of books that he bought when he traveled to France. So French books and the French language and languages were part of his life from a very early age. And he was gifted enough to be able to not just read these books in the original language, but to criticize them and to think about them in those tongues as well.
On the issue of multilingualism, well, I'm hugely passionate about multilingualism, and I think we've got a serious problem. Scotland, the whole of the UK around this, and it's partly, again, comes back to what we were discussing earlier, which is the level of specialization which happens in schools. In most continental Europe, you cannot just study, you can't abstain from studying a language. It doesn't matter actually whether you're attending scientific lyceum or more kind of classical type education or a vocational school, you will do a foreign language. And I do think it's a tragedy, because if you look at the numbers studying modern languages in universities like Glasgow or Edinburgh, St Andrews, which I suppose Aberdeen to some extent, the bastions of which have substantial modern languages schools or faculties. The numbers in some languages are declining. languages like German now, very few people studying it. French holding its own, just about. But what's tending to happen is that less universities are teaching them. Some languages like Spanish still holding up or growing, but it is a tragedy actually, because I genuinely do think that multilingualism is really important. I spent some time with our School of Modern Languages actually just a few weeks ago. They had a strategy day, and I said, look, we really need to go out into schools and make the argument for languages and how important it is to anybody, again, wanting a broad education. I mean, I know how much, as I said, I was born in Italy. I went to primary school in the Netherlands, went to school in Italy again, came here when I was 14. I know how much multilingualism has done for me. And I know similarly, people, who've had similar experience, how important it's been for them. So we need to absolutely fight for this, but it's tricky because if nobody wants to study it, then by definition, it's going to die if we don't do something about it. And I do think, again, this is where I prefer a broad school curriculum. If I were an education secretary with a mandate to do what I wanted, I would do something about that as well, but I'm not.
Do you have any other questions from the board? No.
As someone who was schooled locally in Kirkcaldy, it has surprised me over the years that I never received an hour of education on Adam Smith. It used to be when we came in the bus, we could see a lovely painted sign for Kirkcaldy that said the birthplace of Adam Smith, and it had occurred to me once or twice, who is that guy? But there was no Google at the time, so I couldn't just instantly satisfy myself who he was. But it does bring me to the point of role models and people from your town, people from your area, people from your country, and the role that they could play if they were injected into education at primary, secondary, to help you figure out that maybe you one day could also go on and shape things for your people and the people around the world. Is there something that perhaps the universities could do in conjunction with schools to make sure that some of these moral sentiments, some of these key learning points about Adam Smith are in the curriculum?
Part of the project you've launched is about this, isn't it, Craig? I mean, it's I may want to say a bit about the Templeton Foundation work.
Yeah, so we have part of our work over this year and coming years, actually coming out of the 300th anniversary, is to address precisely the issue that you raise. And so with support from the John Templeton Foundation, we're actually developing educational resources on Adam Smith for every level. So we're going to provide online reading groups. We're going to provide what they call MOOCs, massive online courses that you can have a short introduction to Adam Smith on. But we're also going to design, in partnership with the Economist Foundation, class plans that teachers can use on Adam Smith that aren't just a kind of bolt on to the curriculum. They actually speak to the things that the students have to learn. So introducing Smith and showing that he's relevant by showing how connected he is to something that the students are going to study anyway. And we hope to do that in a way that it becomes attractive to high schools around the world, not just in the UK. Our aim is to do precisely that. It's to make Adam Smith more than the name, more than just the image, to get people to engage with his ideas and make them more accessible. So that is, you're right, it's been a problem in the past, but it's one that we're really trying to address, and it's as part of the legacy that will follow on from this 300th anniversary. Any other questions from the floor? Oh, look at the back.
Hello, thank you. I was just going to ask about how Adam Smith was funded to go through university, because obviously student funding has changed many times over the years, from grants to student loans. You mentioned bursaries as well. So do you have any information about that, how he would have paid for his fees if there were any and living expenses and so on?
Yes, well, sorry. Yes, so Smith's family were not wealthy, but they were able to fund his education themselves. But as I say, the provisions of his father's will left money for the upkeep of Adam and his sometimes forgotten half brother, who died relatively young. So there were two provisions in the will for Hugh and Adam for their education in the future. So obviously the father had thought ahead in terms of looking after his son. So he's not named as Adam because he wasn't christened until the father had passed away, but the provisions there for children. But yes, the bursaries would have existed in many of these towns and would start to develop around through the 18th and into the 19th century. And I think many of them still exist in some form today. Yeah.
Indeed, and in some of them we have had to repurpose because they're no longer relevant for the 21st century. They might have been linked to particular religious sort of, they had religious exclusions and things. But we have a lot of these are in our endowments. In fact, you know, whenever they say that universities have large endowments, we do, but they're not as large as US endowments. You know, Glasgow will have endowments around £200 million. A large proportion of that is actually for scholarships. And so over time, we've repurposed them to make sure they're relevant to, you know, exclusion from universities these days is largely, will be socioeconomic means. So we've tried to divert a lot of them towards widening access to education when they're not specific or they haven't been given specifically for a particular geographic area. So, but yeah, no, it's a remarkable history of some of these scholarships and bursaries that were created.
Other questions? No? Yeah, I think we'll make this the final one, I think, and then we can finish the close.
I believe his mother, I believe, and his family, they were very friendly with the Oswald family. Is that right? I wondered whether the Oswalds might have supported him in some way as well. I just wondered if we know anything much more about the relationship there.
I think it was a close connection by, probably made more close by the fact that the boys were so close in age. So I think that James Oswald was slightly older than Smith, but there was a long-term friendship and affinity there. I imagine that they probably did have a hand, as influential local people did have a hand in assisting the funding of these kinds of bursary that we're talking about here. I don't think we have any evidence directly of I can't recall any evidence directly of them assisting Smith when he was a student. We have the details that Anton alluded to of what it would have cost him in terms of the fees and things like that, and the speculation is that he had an aunt who lived in Glasgow as well, and so that was perhaps one of the reasons why that was an attractive place for him to study at the time. But no, they were definitely very close friends, and also I suppose there were periods where Smith was away from Kirkcaldy and his mother was here, and she at those times would have been part of the social circle of that group of people who lived in the town at the time. So yeah, it's a very close relationship. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, so I wonder if you'll just take a moment and thanks Anton for his talk, and to thank yourselves for such interesting conversation and questions. I'm sure Smith would have very much enjoyed this conversation. Thank you a lot.
Might I also comment that the thing that struck me about the excellent questions was some of them touched on philosophical questions, some of them touched on economic questions, and we had some that touched on language and wider culture, precisely the three themes that are coming up over the course of the next day and a half. So I hope that those of you who found it enjoyable as well as useful this morning will come along to some of the sessions later on. But thank you very much. And thank you to Craig, who is going to be working this afternoon on stage again.